thanks very much to Madeline and other organizers for inviting me to the luncheon and to give this talk. I am most honored by that invitation. And I know that a primary concern for CACOR at the moment is climate change. And my topic, as you can see, is religion, the role of religion in climate change. However, I want to make it clear that, of course, I don't speak to you as one who knows a great deal about climate change science, but I come as a scholar in the field of religion. And in that field, my primary area of study and research is in Buddhist studies. So as you will see, Buddhism will indeed make its way into this talk. And the talk actually has two parts. The first part will be some sober thoughts on religion and climate change. And then for fun, in the second part, we'll look at some archetypal representations of nature in the Buddhist tradition. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to contrast these two realms of concern as baldly as I can. So religion, private belief, faith in unseen and unproven beings, forces, dimensions, climate change, public facts based on scientific measurements of our physical world. Forgive the crass simplification. Stated this way, either one of these categories can be objected to on any number of grounds, but I needed to see it as starkly as this in order to think about it. And I'll venture to say that a whole lot more people would be able to explain what's going on the left side of the slide as opposed to the right side. But looking at it in this way, my questions were, what does one have to do with the other? What role has religion played in climate change and the broader world of environmental protection? And what role could it play? Or do we need to address religion at all? Should we not simply be aiming to educate people to recognize the importance of modifying our behavior, either in soft ways like raising awareness in schools or through more stringent methods, carbon tax, other economic measures, because we're on a fast track to extinction, or at the very least, massive destruction of our living environment? Sounds like a no-brainer. Why bring religion into it? Well, let me quote the famous or infamous Lynn White. What people do about their ecology depends on what they think about themselves in relation to things around them. And how we think about ourselves in relation to others, in relation to nature and to the greater cosmos, is and has been very much the purview of religion. Religion tells us where we fit in the grand cosmic scheme. And throughout history, religion has had the upper hand when it comes to representing the order of the universe. I mean, you know, in the history of contesting worldviews, science is rather a newcomer. Of course, scientific endeavor was not lacking from the ancient world, but until the modern age, it generally took place within the context of religion, not in competition with it. Beyond that, if we think of the relationship between religion and culture, the word culture meaning the sum total of the characteristics of a people, their learned patterns of behavior regarding how they eat, how they dress, the values they hold. Well, culture, this is a word derived from the Latin cultus, meaning worship. Historically, the most defining mark of a group was the way they worshipped, and that had a strong influence on all other aspects of a culture. And even if we think of the present-day world situation, regardless of our own personal views, belief systems and religious values and practices are pretty much normative cultural elements for most of the world's population. And religion is not merely one aspect of culture. I would go so far as to say that in many places, it is still one of the drivers of social, political, and economic action, for good or for ill. And even in places where it is not overtly a force in the socio-political realm, the echoes of its historical presence are still heard. What else drives social, political, and economic action? You guessed it, climate. Let's make it broader. Nature, rat infestation, flood, famine, good harvest, plenty water, no water. These are conditions of the natural world in which society and culture are embedded. However, nature and culture are often represented religiously as well as secularly in a strongly dualistic manner, one that perceives the natural world as either a kind of container or a given space or a location, and human beings as just kind of plunked down in there, either subject to the forces of nature or dominant over them. Shakespeare's words come to mind. All the world's a stage. In other words, a backdrop for the drama that is humanity. Apart from shamanic indigenous systems, most, if not all, religions represent humanity as an intrinsically higher order of being than the rest of the natural world. And this is understood to be the natural and divine order of things. Now, the idea of the privileged place of humanity on earth, this is one that can work both positively and negatively. Lynn White's controversial essay on the historical roots of the ecological crisis speaks to both sides. Although his thesis that Christianity is mostly to blame has been well challenged, nevertheless, his case study of Christianity shows that within this one tradition, you can find views that can be used to support the exploitation of natural resources, as well as those that support a loving, caring, even mystical relationship with nature. Taking, for example, the life of St. Francis as the representation to follow. I believe the present Pope is strongly in support of this religious worldview. St. Francis preaching to the birds. Protestant Christianity, of course, was primarily the object of White's argument, as he blamed the Western exploitation of nature on the use of biblical passages that place nature under man's dominion. But within Protestant Christianity, there is also the notion of the wise steward. Yes, nature is under man's dominion, but man has a responsibility to care and protect for nature, which is God's creation. And I'm going to raise only one point here, and that is that the whole notion of the privileged place of humanity on earth is problematic, because it is this representation that underpins the exploitation and colonization of nature. The idea of wise management of resources or stewardship, that's a positive one, but it has a dark side. Combined with the idea of natural or divine privilege, it can be used to justify what Kipling called the white man's burden. In other words, the intrinsically privileged human must bear the burden of helping the intrinsically lesser, less intelligent, less fortunate, less human. And of course, assistance is always preceded by subjugation. Such ideas underpin a colonizing imperial mindset. In comparison, indigenous animistic worldviews represent human beings as one type of person amongst a world of persons, where health and prosperity depend on harmonious relationships between beings. This is not to say that in dealing that humans cannot or should not use their intelligence to their advantage or to outwit the other. But there is an understanding that in dealing with the natural world, one is negotiating with respected equals. Where did we go? Equals in power and in intelligence. Well-being all around is dependent on a delicate balance between all parties, and humans ignore that balance to their detriment and to their destruction. To me, this kind of worldview is one of the best arguments for preserving and supporting our First Nations peoples, who are the keepers of this vision of humanity and nature. The point that I want to make is that representation is a crucial element in determining culturally appropriate behavior. To take a very common example, if homosexuality is represented as pathology, as it was, then the culturally acceptable behavior is to cure or eradicate the pathology. Where it is represented as criminal, then the culturally appropriate response is punishment. Furthermore, pathology or criminal activity is regarded as outside the social order. It is disorder. It needs to be ordered. Where the cultural representation of homosexuality has changed, we see a related change in culturally acceptable behavior. Similarly, if climate change is represented as only defined by or as belonging only to the domain of science, then the related response behavior tends to be confined to those who participate in the world of science, who accept its parameters. And that representation further sets it up as open to objection by those who regard science as a competing quasi-religious worldview, and can therefore claim that they do not believe in the science of climate change. And as we know, providing more knowledge, more scientific-based evidence is no guarantee of changing people's views, let alone their behaviors. Furthermore, if climate change means that I must change my social habits, stop driving my gas-guzzling car and ride a bike in the wind and the rain, give up everything that comes in plastic packaging, or lose the jobs that come with the pipelines, it starts to feel like it is outside the social order. In fact, it is creating disorder. It needs to be ordered. And here is where we get all the various objections and pseudo-arguments that aim to show climate change as either a fiction or a natural part of the ordered universe, not driven by human activity. I suspect, though, that the climate change deniers are not the only obstacle. Perhaps a greater obstacle are the millions of ordinary people in the world who are not engaged with this endeavor. And why are they not engaged? Well, the everyday business of survival takes a heck of a lot of time and effort. And when one has enough to survive, then, surprise, surprise, greed kicks in. Let's have more of that, you know. He who dies with the most toys wins. So those are some reasons for non-engagement, but we must also think of the fact that for the great majority of people, the representation of climate change and of nature does not speak to them in any compelling way. Our modern relationship with nature has eroded to the point that we seem quite unaffected by its condition, and it definitely appears to have no power to counteract our greed. This is not to say that there is no love for nature among people. There is lots of love of nature, but it is for our sake. Walking barefoot in the grass makes me feel wonderful. Having trees all around will bring down my blood pressure. Okay, I'm not exactly sure about that, but I feel like it should be true. But you get my point. The benefit is still loaded and regarded in my favor, not intrinsically in the favor of nature. Anyway, before I digress too far, let me give you a remarkable example of the effect of changing the representation of nature. In Thailand, in the late 1970s, there were a group of Buddhist monks who were determined to do something about the environmental degradation and the deforestation perpetrated by the local people, for whom survival was their only concern, and the forest simply something to make use of, to survive off of. And of course, not surprising, this just results in a vicious cycle: survival, exploitation of nature, degradation of nature, leading to the suffering of the villagers who are dependent on the nature forest. So the monks decided that they would ordain the trees in the community forest. And they carried out the ordination ritual. They draped the trees in the saffron robes of a monk, and in so sacralizing the forest, changed it from something to be used for human purposes to something valuable in its own right and worthy of veneration. No villager would damage an ordained tree. There is no question that we need practical damage control, immediate solutions focused on government-enforced technological and economic measures and water and earth system management. But beyond that, if we are to truly combat the enemy, who is none other than us, we need a fundamental change in current value systems, socio-cultural practices, and worldview. We need to change our relationship to nature and how we represent nature. These two, our relationship to nature and how we represent nature, these are interdependent, mutually supporting ideas. Religious leaders must be encouraged to be at the forefront of environmental concern. But more importantly, those who are working so hard to combat climate change need to see the value in understanding religious representations of nature and how that influences behavior. Not merely individual behavior, but social and political behavior. Our negative effect on the planet is on such a scale that individual action, valuable though it is not enough. Without the political will that responds to social pressure, the environment will continue to degrade. I mean, slowly and then fastly. It's important then to support those spiritual worldviews which speak most intimately to people, and those religious representations that are conducive to the kind of change that science knows is necessary for us to survive as a species. I recently read somewhere that American Republicans are more likely to agree with measures that combat climate change as long as those measures are not linked with capital C, climate change. I think ideology is going to kill us. I would venture to say that among our young people and among a significant portion of our Western population, there is a hunger for a new worldview, or perhaps it's an old worldview, one that places us in harmony with nature, one that supports the wonder and humility that we feel in the presence of nature, and one that acknowledges the ultimately scientific view that, amazing though we may be, consciousness that knows itself, the Cadillac of the apes, we are one species among a world of species, one life form among a myriad of life forms. There is no rationale for assigning to ourselves a grander place in the universe. And if we still do value ourselves above the lilies of the field, let it be because we have discovered the threads that weave all life together. So that's kind of it for this part of the talk. That's all I have to say about that. And now I'm going to go on to show you some representations from the Buddhist tradition that are not always front and center in the tradition, but are nevertheless present and available. Now, nature, as we know, has been represented in numerous ways, as wild and romantic, as pastoral and idyllic, as red in tooth and claw, as resources to be consumed, unknowing, soulless. One of the most cross-culturally common representations of nature is nature as woman. And it goes with all the stereotypical associations of fertility or infertility, submissive or in need of taming, unpredictable, lacking reason, and therefore naturally and necessarily to be dominated by culture, intelligence, discipline, male representations. In such ways, patriarchy is built into most religions, justified by nature itself. But the power of the universe is in its diversity. Its eyes see everything, its ears hear everything, and its voices speak everything. We just have to listen. So let's listen to some different voices. Like most religions, Buddhism has strong patriarchal elements that are preserved in its texts and practices. However, Buddhism emerged from a religious matrix that honored archetypal female symbols. In what follows, I want to show you how nature and the archetypal feminine was represented in the culture of early Buddhism and how it relates to one contemporary society. So let's start with trees. And if we think of Buddhism and trees, well, then the most famous tree in Buddhism is surely the Bodhi tree. Famous, of course, as the tree under which Gautama sat meditating on the night that he attained enlightenment and became the Buddha sometime in the 5th or 6th century BCE. Now, the Bodhi tree, Bodhi meaning wisdom or knowledge, is properly known as the Ficus religiosa, the religious fig, also known as the peepal tree, and it has very distinctive heart-shaped pointed leaves. But why is the Buddha sitting under this particular tree, and how does it relate to our topic? So to answer that, we have to look at an image that dates some 2,000 years before the Buddha. This is a seal from the Indus Valley in the northwest region of India, dating to 2500 BCE. And in it, we see the ritual worship of a female figure standing among the branches of a peepal tree. And we can identify the tree because of its distinctive heart-shaped leaves. Fun fact, this is the earliest known representation of a tree in Indian art. Now, although the Brahmanical religion that was eventually established in India, that developed with a distinctly patriarchal caste, the great mother of the Indus Valley was never forgotten. She returned in such powerful pan-Hindu goddesses as Durga or Lakshmi that we see here. But the goddess also appeared in numerous versions of a particular type of lesser, more local female spirit called Yakshi, associated with trees, earth, and water. She is a symbol of the fertility of the earth and its manifestation in flowering and fruit-bearing trees. She is often pictured as naked, very beautiful, sensuous, and voluptuous, very energetic. You can see that three-bend pose, 1, 2, 3. It's a stylistic element to indicate energy. And she's grasping onto the branch of the tree, which flowers at her touch. Now, the Yakshi is not merely holding on to the branch, she's actually breaking the branch. In this image, the crossed over leg helps with the three-bend pose, but it also indicates something that she is doing to the tree. And we see it here in this very active scene where she has her leg wrapped around the tree trunk and her arm grasping the branch. So this image echoes an ancient Indian spring festival ritual called the Dohada ritual, in which a beautiful and chaste young woman brings the tree into bloom by touching it with her foot, which is what we see here. The Yakshi striking the tree with her foot and breaking the branch. She is called Shalabanjika Yakshi, literally the Yakshi who is breaking a branch of the Shala tree. Now, March, April is the time of the Dohada ritual, and you'll have to forgive the startling Art Nouveau here. I couldn't find any old representations of this scene. And Dohada literally means pregnancy longing. It is the craving for certain things that pregnant women get that must be satisfied. So the idea is that the tree also has this longing at springtime and cannot flower until it is satisfied by a beautiful and chaste young woman. And of course, Indian poets and playwrights have written many romantic scenes around this ancient spring ritual. So we can ask, what does the tree long for? And amazingly, it depends on what type of tree you are. The Ashoka or the Shala tree longs to be touched by the foot of a woman. But if you are a Tilaka tree, then you are longing for the glance of a beautiful woman. The Champaka longs to hear a lovely woman's laugh. And the Bakula tree wants a beautiful woman to spray wine from her mouth all over it. Who knew trees could be this much fun? But some interesting side notes arise from this. First, we get the idea that nature participates in the social order with its own needs and desires. Second, the female in this setting functions not merely as a complementary symbol of fertility in the sense of sympathetic magic. She is in no way passive. In fact, she is an active, catalyzing, we might even say fertilizing force, without which the tree cannot flower or bear fruit. Okay, so you have to hold that now in one corner of your mind. And now we go back to the Buddha, to the divine order. And in representations of the Buddha's birth, what we see is his mother, Maya Devi, portrayed in exactly the same voluptuous, highly sexualized form as the Yakshi earth tree spirit. Here she is in the three-bend pose, grasping the branch of a Shala tree, linking her not only to the fertility Yakshi deities, but all the way back to the earliest Indus Valley representation of the tree goddess. Now, in the representations of the life story of the Buddha, there is quite a dramatic divergence between the textual material produced by monks and the popular stories and iconographic material produced more likely by lay people. In the monastic texts, women symbolize the sexuality and the seduction of worldly life, that which has to be overcome if one is to attain enlightenment and be victorious over desire and death. We have, here's a quote from one Pali text saying, the Buddha saying, monks, if ever one would rightly say it is wholly a snare of Mara, Mara being the Buddhist version of Satan or the devil, verily speaking, rightly one may say of womanhood, it is wholly a snare of Mara. And I mean, we're not talking about this woman or that woman. We're talking about womanhood. So, as you may know, the Buddha was born a prince and lived in a palace. But in his life story, he finally rejects the whole thing. He rejects women, sexuality, and the world. And he leaves the palace and spends 6 years of his life exclusively among male ascetics, engaging in the most severe practices intended to denigrate and destroy the body, nature. So, according to the oral tradition, the gods in the heaven world are worried that he's going to die of starvation and miss his destiny, which is to become a Buddha. But they don't know what to do. And so they turn to his mother, Maya. She is in heaven because she died 1 week after giving birth. So in the story, Mother Maya appears to the fasting Gautama and reminds him of all the prophecies made of him and of his destiny. And like a good son who has wandered down the wrong path, he promises her that he'll shape up and achieve his goal. And anytime I think of that story, I can't help but have this image of Mother Maya standing in front of her son, looking at him and saying, eat something. Anyway, in the oral tradition, this mother-son moment has the effect of shaking him out of the world-rejecting path that he was following. It's very interesting that it is this moment between mother and son where he decides against this path. And as the story unfolds, a village girl named Sujata, along with the women of her village, bring an offering of milk and rice for Gautama. And it's from this point that in the oral tradition, we see quite a reversal of the rejection of women that marked his exit from the palace. And the next day, he walks to the village and he accepts a meal in Sujata's house. And the oral tradition says that when Sujata offered her meal, he thought to himself, now that Sujata has offered such food to me, there can be no doubt after partaking of it, I will obtain the perfect supreme enlightenment of a Buddha. So we see here again the activity of the woman serving as a necessary catalyst for enlightenment. Without her action, there is some doubt. With her action, there is no doubt. In the oral tradition, there is an atmosphere of female support and protection. But beyond that, there is a sense of collaboration between male and female in the grand enterprise of enlightenment. And with the change in the representation of women, there is a corresponding intertwining of life and death, being in the world and transcending the world, rather than the rejection that motivated his previous asceticism. So now we're going on to one of the most dramatic moments in the Buddha's life, the assault on Gautama by Mara, the Buddhist devil. So according to the story, as Gautama sits meditating under the Bodhi tree with his mind set on enlightenment, Mara approaches with all his armies, intending to turn Gautama away from enlightenment, but nothing works. And finally, Mara challenges the Buddha, or Gautama, to produce a witness who could vouch for his virtue and his worthiness to be a Buddha. So this is the famous earth-touching scene in which Gautama, who is sitting all by himself under a tree in the forest and has no witness, he calls on the earth goddess to be his witness. And in a beautiful Thai painting, we see her rising up out of the earth, and twisting her hair, she releases a flood of water that washes Mara and his armies away. We can recognize in her, of course, the Yakshi spirits of earth, trees, and water. So now the question is, What happened here? Was Gautama unable to defeat Mara without the aid of the earth goddess? Did the earth goddess actually save the Buddha from Mara? There are a few interpretations that can be put on this. However, fast forward to the modern day Thailand, and we will find that the earth goddess as savior is exactly the popular perception. Statue fountains of the earth goddess can be found throughout the country. And these statues are almost always associated with fountains or water. And in many cases, her long hair is constructed as a pipe out of which the water flows that swept away the armies of Mara. And in the popular mind, she is the vanquisher of Mara, the savior of the Buddha. And if she can save the Buddha, then obviously she is the one to call on when people are threatened. So throughout the 20th century, Nang Thorani, as she is known in Thailand, she has served as a rallying point for the Thai people whenever they felt under siege by outside forces. And she has been a focus for the people not only during political crisis, but equally during economic crisis. During the severe financial crisis of the late 90s, when the country was nearly bankrupt and the IMF had imposed very harsh economic reforms, businesses were collapsing. At that time, there were newspaper articles claiming that although foreign countries were trying to take over the Thai economy, there was gold hidden in the ground that Nang Thorani would soon reveal to make Thailand rich again. And there was even a Thai millionaire who established a mining company to search for Thorani's gold. On the most ordinary level, her image conjures up feelings of safety and protection in the population. So it's not surprising that the pure drinking water that came from Bangkok's first water treatment plant, it flowed through a pipe in Nang Thorani's hair, because before that they drank the river water, which resulted in lots of sickness. So, in conclusion, despite the patriarchal and often misogynistic record of Buddhism coming from its early texts, I would suggest that there is another story to be told in the archetypal female imagery that is omnipresent in Buddhist iconography. It's a story that links the divine order with the natural order and the social order through the representation of the feminine as a trope for nature. And in this imagery, nature is valued not in terms of fertility or productivity, but in terms of mutual collaboration and cooperation with society. Every religion has a range of stories to be told, stories of domination, subjugation, and power, as well as stories of stewardship, responsibility, harmony, and cooperation. We have seen what comes of locating ourselves as humanity in nature. Our job is to nurture those stories that promote a vision of humanity as nature. Perhaps the energy of the archetypal earth goddess can inspire us to reimagine how climate change might be represented in a way that speaks to the heart as well as the head. And in any case, she has my vote as our symbol for next week's World Water Day. So, thank you. Bye.